The Zealand and the Valari will not negotiate. Kel's voice thundered through the great hall, his 6 eyes narrowing as he swept his gaze over the gathered delegates. This council wastes time while war prepares to consume entire systems. A wave of reactions rippled through the chamber, displays flickering, cycling through war-torn regions, fleets massing along burning borders, entire sectors already scarred by battle. The vast circular chamber pulsed with heated voices. The Valari refuse all diplomatic attempts. A delegate from the Kashari Compact spat, his tendrils shifting restlessly. They view compromise as weakness. How do you negotiate with those who see surrender in every concession? The Zealand are no different. The Silharan Trade Alliance delegate added, his elongated arms covered in shifting bioluminescent feathers lashing out against his console, a sharp trilling noise akin to static distortion emitted from his throat, his species' equivalent of outrage. They only understand force. If we do not intervene, their war will spill into council-controlled space. And how do you propose we intervene? Another delegate shot back. A blockade sanctions. We all know how little they care for diplomacy. The only thing stopping this war is fear of the other's retaliation. A ripple of uneasy silence followed, broken only by the hum of council systems processing and displaying data. The harsh glow of the galactic map reflected off the polished chamber floor, spinning projections of casualty estimates, fleet maneuvers, and strategic failures. Then a voice cut through the chaos. The humans volunteer. Silence slammed into the room like a kinetic blast. Dozens of eyes, organic and artificial, swiveled toward the speaker. Chancellor Elias Okafor stood firm, his hands clasped behind his back. The sharp lines of his diplomatic uniform remained unmoving beneath the weight of every gaze now pinned on him. A scoff broke the silence. Humans. Vorton, the Kashari delegate, let out a dry, clicking laugh. You are barely out of your own system. You expect the Council to entrust you with mediating a war that has outlasted your species' presence in space. Your kind is impulsive. A representative from the Iron Coalition added, his mandibles twitching in distaste. Strategically reckless, emotionally volatile. Why should we believe you're capable of handling this? Okafor didn't flinch. He moved forward slowly, letting his presence alone command the space. When he spoke, his voice was calm, firm, cutting through the lingering scoffs like a blade. Because we understand conflict. A pause, a shift in the air. We understand what it means when war is inevitable. Okafor continued, his voice steady, his dark eyes unwavering. We understand how it spirals, how it consumes everything, and how sometimes the only way to prevent annihilation is by knowing when to strike and when not to. A few murmurs of dissent stirred, but Okafor pressed forward, activating the hollow emitter embedded in his podium. The galactic map twisted, zooming in on a cluster of stars near the Orion Spur. 20 standard cycles ago, the Zra Dominion began a systematic purge of the Aridan cluster. You remember this conflict? He didn't pose it as a question. A minor skirmish. The Council called it a contained engagement, but we knew what it was. The hollow image shifted, replaying grainy footage of desolate planets. Charred city stations left adrift with their life support systems severed. The room once filled with arguments and scorn grew still. You deliberated, Okafor said, his tone sharpening. You debated in this very chamber while entire systems died, while colonies suffocated under siege. The image flickered again. A new fleet, sleek and dark, emerged from the void. And then a single human task force arrived. The footage rolled forward, 12 ships dwarfed by a Dominion fleet 3 times their size, ghosting through the void with drives, cold hulls painted to deflect scans, silent entry, no transmissions. Then impact kinetic strikes shattered Dominion supply lines with precision. Covert teams armored in adaptive exosuits breached the command stations in synchronized maneuvers. Dominion officers barely had time to react before their command links went dark, their fleet suddenly leaderless, confused. The enemy never saw them coming. In one night, Okafor said, his voice unwavering, we shattered their blockade. We cut their command structure at the throat. We rescued millions while the rest of you deliberated. Silence. The weight of the truth bore down on the chamber. Okafor let it sit before driving the final blow. You underestimate us now, just as you did then. The chamber erupted once more, not with dismissal but with discourse. Voices raised, debating, arguing, calculating. The humans, they are scavengers of war, nothing more. They brawl among themselves. Even now their own history is a testament to their savagery. And yet, despite their brutality, they have survived, adapted, excelled. Perhaps that is exactly what is needed here. They lack numbers, but they have tactics. This is madness. They will drag us all into their wars. Or they will prevent one. Kill. leaned forward, his elongated fingers drumming against his armrest. And you believe humanity alone can mediate this war? Okafor's expression remained impassive. I believe we are the only ones willing to do what is necessary to prevent it. He let the words settle, reading the chamber's shifting tide, the hesitation, the calculation, the reluctant consideration, then the supreme arbiter, his ancient form draped in ceremonial robes interwoven with the insignia of 1,000 worlds, lifted a withered hand. The murmurs in the chamber ceased instantly. His voice, though frail, carried the weight of centuries. The council will discuss the matter. Okafor held his ground a moment longer, his gaze sweeping across the gathered delegates. He let the weight of his words linger, then spoke just loud enough for the chamber to hear. Of course, debate is, after all, the most efficient weapon against war. A few voices grumbled, others stiffened. Unreadable. Kel leaned forward, his dark eyes locked onto the human chancellor. His elongated fingers drummed once against his armrest before he exhaled a slow breath. Enough, he said at last, though his voice carried little conviction. Let them try. A ripple of discomfort passed through the chamber. Vorton's mandibles clicked in protest, his voice a low hiss of contempt. This is insanity. They will only escalate the conflict. The Silurian delegate's feathers flared with agitation. Another voice from the shadows added, if the humans fail, the blood of entire systems will be on this council's hands. The Supreme Arbiter's withered hand lifted slightly, silencing the murmurs. His gaze, old as empires, settled on Okafor. Then let them carry that burden. Okafor did not blink. Then we will not give you a mess to clean. A final pause, a breath held. The Supreme Arbiter exhaled slowly, his withered hand lowered. The council agrees. The silence between General Rooker and High Strategist Zelver was suffocating, the tension in the room pressing down on everyone, an unspoken challenge hanging in the air. Chancellor Elias Duval let the moment stretch just long enough to ensure both leaders understood the gravity of their situation. Then he spoke, his voice even but firm. You are both here because the alternative is extinction, he repeated, his gaze shifting between them. Neither the Zealand nor the Valari can afford another decade of this war. The bodies pile higher, your fleets grow weaker, and your enemies wait for you to bleed yourselves dry. This is your chance to decide, does your species survive, or does it burn? Rooker's mandibles clicked together in irritation, the deep crimson ridges on his armored exoskeleton darkening as his muscles tensed. We do not fear war, Chancellor. We have fought for centuries, we have bled and endured. What could humans possibly teach us about survival? Zelver let out a slow breath, the bioluminescent veins beneath his violet skin shifting hues. Survival is not your strength, Rooker. Destruction is. Your kind revels in conflict. It is all you know. He turned his glowing eyes toward Duval. But humans, they are different. Your people do not wage war for dominance alone. You fight to endure, to adapt, to consume everything in your path. That is why the Council has allowed this experiment. Duval clasped his hands behind his back, his expression unreadable. The Council allowed this because they know what I know. You are both out of time. There is no victory left for either of you, only annihilation. He took a measured step forward. And humanity understands war far better than you think. A murmur rippled through the gathered envoys behind both Rooker and Zelver. Lena Corinne, standing just behind Duval, kept her hand close to her sidearm, reading the subtle shifts in posture from both delegations. It wouldn't take much for this fragile meeting to collapse. Into bloodshed. Rooker's mandibles twitched, his deep voice a low growl. You think yourselves superior, Chancellor, because your species won a handful of battles against enemies unprepared for your reckless tactics. Duval exhaled sharply through his nose, his eyes sharp as he regarded the general. I think we are the only species willing to do what must be done. I think we are the only ones who understand that war isn't about honor or posturing. It's about ending the fight before it consumes everything. Zelver's glowing markings pulsed in slow, calculating waves. And how, exactly, do you intend to do that, Chancellor? Duval glanced at Lena, giving her a slight nod. She tapped a control pad, and the room dimmed as a holographic projection materialized above them. The galactic map shifted, zooming in on a contested system along the Zealand-Valari border. Tactical markers flickered, showing battle-scarred planets and shifting fleet formations. Then a new formation appeared, a human task force, small but strategically placed in a way that disrupted both factions' supply lines without direct engagement. You both think of war as a contest of strength. Duval said as the simulation played out. Humanity thinks of it as a problem to be solved. We do not need to defeat you in battle. We need to make it impossible for you to fight at all. Rooker's eyes narrowed. Zelver's fingers twitched slightly. The chamber was deathly quiet, save for the hum of the projection. Duval let the simulation play a moment longer before he spoke again. This war ends one way or another. Either you make the choice, or we make it for you. The words hung in the air like a blade over their throats, and for the first time in years, both the Zealand and the Valari hesitated. The silence in the room was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a palpable force, a suffocating weight that seemed to press down on everyone, making it harder to breathe. Every movement felt deliberate, like the slightest twitch of a muscle could trigger the explosion that was lurking in the shadows. General Rooker stood still, his mandibles twitching with barely restrained fury, while High Strategist Zelver's bioluminescent veins pulsed rapidly in a dissonant pattern, his body language betraying a deep, simmering anger. Chancellor Elias Duval let the silence stretch on, his eyes flicking between the two alien leaders. He knew this moment was critical. His words had already struck the raw nerve he had hoped for. Their pride, their unshakable belief in their superiority. He could see it in their faces, hear it in the barely contained growls of Rooker and the tightness in Zelver's voice. They didn't want to admit it, but Duval had already won the psychological battle. The question was whether they would accept the truth he had laid before them, or whether their pride would doom them. You are both here because the alternative is extinction. Duval's voice rang out again, louder this time, cutting through the tension. This war is your species' last gamble, a gamble you cannot afford to lose. His words were sharp, unforgiving, and they hit like a hammer to the chest. The stakes had never been clearer. The room seemed to shrink as his gaze bore into them, his words pressing on their fragile egos. Rooker's deep voice shattered the quiet, a low growl laced with contempt. We have fought for centuries, Chancellor, centuries. What could humans possibly teach us about survival? Duval's gaze didn't waver. His expression remained even, but his eyes were cold and calculating, like a predator assessing its prey. Survival is not about being able to fight forever, General. It's about knowing when to stop fighting and finding another way to endure. Rooker's mandibles clicked sharply, a sign of growing agitation, but Duval pressed on. We've all seen what your wars have cost you, fleets reduced to scrap metal, planets turned to dust, and for what? Honor? You fight for your pride, but it's your people who suffer. This is no longer a war for dominance, General, it is a war for survival. If you continue on this path, you will not only destroy yourselves, you will destroy everything in your path. Zelver's eyes burned with a cold fire, his bioluminescence flashing in an angry spectrum of colors as his voice sliced through the air. And what about you, Chancellor? Humanity doesn't wage war for survival alone, do you? No, you fight to consume, to adapt, to bend everything to your will. You see our desperation, and you think you can exploit it. This experiment the Council has allowed. Is this how you propose peace? Duval didn't flinch, his eyes locked onto Zelver's, the tension in the room growing unbearable. This isn't about exploiting anyone, strategist, it's about offering you a choice. He paused, his voice low and steady, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. The only thing left for either of your species is extinction. If you choose to fight on, your bodies will pile higher, your fleets will crumble, and your enemies will take advantage of your weakness. The only question left is whether you'll continue fighting until there is nothing left to fight for. Lena Corinne, standing just behind Duval, felt the temperature of the room shift. Her hand rested near her sidearm, but she was careful. Too many times she'd seen negotiations like this turn into bloodbaths. In an instant she was ready, but she hoped it wouldn't come to that. The holographic map shimmered to life again, casting a cold blue light over the chamber. Duval stepped forward, his voice now sharper, more commanding. Your fleets, General, are already vulnerable. You cannot sustain this war for much longer. Humanity does not need to defeat you in battle. We do not need to fight you directly. We just need to make it impossible for you to keep fighting. Rooker's eyes narrowed, his fists clenched at his sides, and Zelver's hands twitched as though ready to strike. But the room was deathly still. The tension between them was unbearable, like the thin thread that would snap at any moment. Impossible? Rooker growled, his voice rising with the first hints of panic. What kind of madness are you suggesting, Chancellor? What could a few human ships possibly do to halt the might of the Zealand and Valari combined? You would wage war on us by subterfuge? Duval turned slightly, his face still unreadable. This isn't war, this is logistics. Humanity doesn't need to beat you in combat, we only need to cripple your supply chains, target your infrastructure, create fractures in your unity, your fleets, your soldiers. They depend on something, everything depends on something, and we will make sure you don't have it. The projection flickered, revealing the systems at the heart of the conflict. Systems that both the Zealand and Valari had relied on for resources, trade, and reinforcements. A small human task force, far smaller than either faction's fleets, was poised in key locations, intercepting trade routes, blocking communications, and strangling their supplies. The human forces didn't need to fight directly, they were simply cutting off the life force of the war machine. This war is not about strength, Duval continued, his voice cold and calculating. It's about will. Humanity has the will to survive, and we will do whatever it takes to ensure that we endure. You will bleed yourselves dry, unable to fight without resources, and when your fleets crumble, there will be nothing left but the ruins of your war. Zelver's glowing eyes flickered with disbelief and outrage. You think we will just bend to this? You think we will allow you to manipulate us like puppets? Duval's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was nothing warm about it. You don't have to bend, you just need to stop fighting, let the war die, and you'll survive. Continue, and you will both perish, along with everything else. Rooker let out a low, furious growl, his mandibles clenching so tightly that they threatened to crack. Your kind are so arrogant, you think you can control us with your tactics. But we are not cowards like your enemies, we do not fear war, we are war. Duval stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Rooker's. Then let me remind you what real survival looks like. He nodded to Lena, who activated a secondary feed. A new hologram appeared, images of once proud cities reduced to rubble, entire species wiped out, and fleets scattered to the stars. Humanity, though battered, had survived the worst war in its history. Its people adapted, rebuilt, and thrived. The ghosts of fallen empires surrounded them, but humanity had endured. The question is simple, General, Duval said, his voice lowering to a razor's edge. Are you strong enough to let go of your pride and survive? Or will you burn everything, your species, your future, because of it? The words hung in the air, and for the first time in decades, Rooker and Zelver hesitated. The silence that followed was deafening, and this time, it wasn't just a pause, it was a reckoning. The room was deathly silent, the tension thick enough to suffocate anyone who dared breathe too loudly. Every gaze was fixed on General Rooker and High Strategist Zelver, their faces taut with emotion, pride, fury, frustration, and something else, something far more dangerous. Beneath the calculated calm of Chancellor Duval, beneath the coldness of his words, there was an ever-present awareness of the precipice they all stood on. Rooker's mandibles clicked again, not out of irritation but out of a deep-seated internal conflict. His once steely resolve had been chipped away, piece by piece, until he was left with the bitter truth that Duval's words were undeniable. This was the endgame, the moment when history would be written, not by warlords or emperors, but by a species that had once been seen as a reckless, primitive force, now threatening the very foundation of galactic conflict. The Zealand had been warriors since their birth, survival, strength, dominance, these were their guiding principles. But here, in this moment, those principles felt hollow. The question wasn't how they would survive the war, but whether they could survive themselves. Could they let go of everything they had ever known, everything that made them Zealand, in favor of some unknown future? Zelver, on the other hand, was a different kind of warrior. His mind worked in intricate patterns, always calculating, always thinking several steps ahead. He had watched humanity's rise with a mixture of contempt and fear. How could such a small species, with such a short history, overcome the ancient, vast empires of the galaxy? And yet, time and time again, they had shown that their strength wasn't in numbers or sheer firepower. It was in their ability to adapt. Zelver had always been proud of his strategic brilliance, but he could see that humanity had forced his hand. Their tactic wasn't brute strength, but subtlety and cunning. They had already planted the seeds of chaos. And the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. If they didn't adapt, if they didn't evolve, the Zealand and Valari would both be swept away, forgotten in the wake of humanity's rise. You think we will just fold? Zelver hissed, his voice low, dripping with disdain. You think we will simply submit to your way of doing things? Duval didn't flinch. It's not about submission, Zelver. It's about survival. Your way is broken, as is Rooker's. The war has become a deadlock, and you're both losing. Not to humanity, but to yourselves. Rooker's gaze darkened. You speak as if you have already won, Chancellor. Duval's voice remained unyielding. I don't need to win in battle, General. I just need to win in time. I have a plan, and you will see that it works, or you'll be consumed by the same forces that have ravaged you for decades. For a long moment, neither of the alien leaders spoke. The room felt like it was closing in around them, the space between them and Duval growing tighter with every second. They were being cornered, and neither knew how to fight their way out of this one. The Zealand and Valari, two of the greatest warfaring species in the galaxy, were now faced with a force they could neither understand nor predict. Humanity. The mere thought seemed ludicrous. How had they come to this? How had they been outmaneuvered by such a young species? Zelver's glowing veins pulsed in a slow rhythm, as though he were weighing something heavy on his mind. His fingers twitched, not out of anger, but out of the realization that Duval had said nothing that wasn't true. For the first time in his life, Zelver wasn't sure who was the master strategist. Rooker, too, felt the shift. It was subtle, but undeniable. Humanity wasn't just playing a game of war, they were playing a game of fate. It wasn't about beating them on the battlefield. It wasn't about proving dominance. It was about control over their futures, their destinies. And if they didn't take action soon, they would find themselves irrelevant. What do you expect us to do? Rooker asked, his voice a low growl, one born of both frustration and desperation. You say we must bend, but we will not bend to you. Duval's eyes never wavered. You misunderstand, General. I'm not asking you to bend. I'm offering you a chance to stand. But to do that, you need to evolve. Your people, both of you, have spent centuries locked in conflict, unable to see the bigger picture. I am showing you that bigger picture. There was a moment of hesitation. Rooker and Zelver exchanged a glance. It wasn't one of alliance, but of understanding. For all the differences, the reality was the same. War was no longer the answer. The war they had fought for centuries had reached its bitter end, and no amount of military strategy, no amount of bloodshed, would change that fact. You want us to abandon our war for survival? Zelver finally said, his voice cool, but tinged with the growing understanding of the stakes. To let go of the only thing that has ever defined us? Yes, Duval replied simply. Because the alternative is extinction. The words hung in the air like a blade, sharp and cold. The finality in Duval's voice was clear. This wasn't a diplomatic negotiation anymore. It was a stark reality. Rooker and Zelver had to choose between the survival of their species and the death of their way of life. Rooker's eyes narrowed, his body stiffening once more. And if we refuse? If we fight on? Duval's expression hardened. Then you will both die. Your fleets will crumble, your people will be lost, and the war you fought for so long will mean nothing. A long silence followed. The weight of Duval's words sunk in, each syllable a heavy toll on their psyche. The galaxy they knew, the one that had been shaped by their wars, their conquests, their empires, was no longer theirs to command. Humanity had shifted the balance, and now, the future hung in the balance. Zelver's voice was quieter now, but there was a hint of something like regret in it. Is there no other way? Duval's gaze softened, but there was no mistaking the resolve behind it. This is the only way forward. We're at the precipice, Zelver. You know that as well as I do. If we don't change the game, we will all lose. The room was still, the air thick with the enormity of the decision ahead. Rooker clenched his fists, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. There was a part of him, a warrior's part, that wanted to reject Duval's offer. His pride demanded it. But there was another part, a part that knew the truth, that understood the bitter calculus of survival. Could they afford to keep fighting, to keep destroying everything around them for the sake of pride? Could they afford to ignore the fact that their people were already on the brink? Zelver turned slowly, his eyes meeting Rooker's. The two generals shared a long, wordless look. They had been comrades in arms, warriors of the highest order, and now they were faced with an impossible choice. The war had always been their life, their purpose. And now, they were being asked to abandon it for something they didn't fully understand. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Rooker spoke, his voice low but resolute. If we accept your offer, Chancellor, what happens to our people? To our culture? Duval's expression softened, though there was still an edge of steel in his voice. You adapt. You evolve. Your people will live. And in time, you will learn to thrive in a galaxy that has changed forever. As the final words of the Chancellor echoed through the room, the silence grew oppressive. The weight of the decision that lay before Rooker and Zelver was no longer just a matter of pride or strategy. It was the difference between life and death. The future of their species rested not on their ability to wage war, but on their willingness to change, to let go of the very thing that had defined them for centuries. Rooker stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the floor as the holographic map of the contested system continued to flicker before him. He could almost hear the ghosts of fallen comrades and ancestors whispering in his ear, urging him to stand firm, to resist. The Zealand had never been known to bow to anyone. They had fought, bled, and survived against countless enemies. To relinquish their way of life, to accept the terms of this strange human, felt like betrayal. But beneath the anger and defiance that churned in his chest, something else gnawed at him. The constant losses. The endless battles. The toll it had taken on his people. They were on the brink of annihilation, their fleets battered, their colonies scattered. His pride demanded one last stand, but his instincts whispered that there would be nothing left to fight for if they continued down this path. He looked up at Duval, who met his gaze with an unsettling calmness. The Chancellor was unwavering, his eyes piercing, as if he could see the conflict swirling within Rooker's mind. It was as if Duval knew that this was the moment. This was where everything would change. Finally, it was Zelver who broke the silence. The High Strategist's voice was quiet, almost resigned, as he spoke. You are right, Chancellor. The war has become pointless. We have fought long enough to know that there is no victory left in this conflict. We will not win this way. Rooker's mandibles clicked in frustration, but he didn't interrupt. Zelver's words struck a chord deep within him, echoing the doubts he had kept buried for far too long. His thoughts raced, spinning in endless circles. He had always believed that the Zealand were meant to dominate, to be the apex predators in the galaxy. But now, as the devastation of their endless wars lay bare before him, he realized that dominance had become their prison. Zelver turned to him, his violet eyes glowing with a hint of something. Was it regret? Or perhaps it was resignation. Rooker, you and I both know that humanity's rise is not some fluke. They are not just another faction vying for control. They are a force that cannot be ignored. Rooker's fist clenched, and for a moment, he was torn. The warrior in him wanted to fight, to rally his people and push back against this human encroachment. But deep down, he knew it was a futile effort. Humanity's tactics were too clever, too calculated. If they did not adapt, they would be wiped out. They would become nothing more than a footnote in history, their legacy erased by the relentless march of time. With a final, heavy exhale, Rooker turned to face Duval. His voice was low, thick with a mixture of bitterness and resignation. We will accept your terms, Chancellor. Not because we are weak, but because we are wise enough to see that continuing this war will only destroy us all. Duval nodded once, his expression solemn but determined. Good. You've made the right choice. For a moment, there was silence again. But this time, it wasn't oppressive. It was filled with the weight of decisions made and futures uncertain. The Chancellor's eyes flickered over to Lena Corinne, who was standing at the ready near the side. She gave him a subtle nod, her hand never straying far from the sidearm at her waist. It was a gesture of trust, of knowing that the delicate balance of power they had just negotiated was not something that could be taken lightly. I will contact the Council immediately, Duval said. We have much to discuss. The terms of your survival are not just about surrendering to humanity, they are about shaping a future together. A new alliance, where old animosities can be set aside, where Zealand and Valari can coexist alongside us, without the fear of destruction. Zelver stepped forward, his voice steady. And what of our people, Chancellor? Will they be allowed to rebuild? To maintain their cultures and histories? Duval's gaze softened. Yes. But there will need to be compromises. Change cannot come without sacrifice. Your species will be integrated into a new order, one where cooperation is not just encouraged, but required. The room was quiet once more, each person processing the gravity of what had just transpired. The Valari and Zealand had always been isolated, mistrustful of one another, their histories marked by bloodshed and betrayal. But now, they were being asked to lay down their arms and build something new, something that had never existed before, a shared future. Rooker turned his gaze back to the galactic map, the flickering lights of distant star systems reflecting in his eyes. The war had taken so much from them, and yet here they stood, on the cusp of something entirely different. Could they make this work? Could they truly abandon centuries of enmity and hatred in favor of something greater? Only time would tell. I trust you understand what this means for our people, Zelver said, his tone unyielding. The road ahead will be long and uncertain. We may need your help. Duval met his gaze. You will have it. Together, we can rebuild the galaxy. The two alien leaders turned to one another, an unspoken understanding passing between them. There was no grand gesture, no handshake, no immediate promise of unity. But for the first time in a long time, there was the glimmer of hope, a fragile thread that they could choose to hold on to, if they were brave enough. And with that, the fate of two ancient species, and the future of the galaxy, hung in the balance.